eine Aufnahme.
Hello, BBC. This is Godfrey Talbot recording on the outskirts of Tripoli itself on the morning of this historic day of January the 23rd. 20 yards from me here stands the Army Commander, General Montgomery, and the town is formally being handed to him. The General is smiling a little now. He is, need I say, in very, very good form.
In February 1943, Winston Churchill went to North Africa to greet the victors of Alamein at the first victory parade of the war.
Tripoli has never seen such a sight as this. The great march past before Mr. Churchill, the CNC, General Alexander, Sir Alan Brooke and General Montgomery. The march past is just beginning, and it's begun, as you heard, with the massed pipes and drums of the Highlanders.
There was a splendid march past, and a little dais was raised, Monty there and Winston there. I think they all found it very moving. It was a pause in the war, really. The Germans were retreating so fast that we could pause for a minute.
One continent, at least, has been cleansed and purged forever from fascist or Nazi tyranny. The African excursions of the two dictators have cost their countries, in killed and captured, 950,000 soldiers.
But he really travels, doesn't he? Boy, he's been around. He's been to Casablanca more than Humphrey Bogart. And he knows all the shortcuts. We just followed his cigar ashes, got here just like that.
Mussolini's African empire and Corporal Hitler's strategy are alike exploding. The proud German army has once again proved the truth of the saying, the Hun is always either at your throat or your feet.
Both victory and humour were in the air. Taking its lead from Churchill, the BBC followed the government directive to make dirty cracks against the Germans in musical sketches wherever possible. Advice followed by the actor and singer Noel Coward.
Don't let's be beastly to the Germans when our victory is ultimately won. It was just those nasty Nazis who persuaded them to fight, and their Beethoven and Bach are really far worse than their bite. Let's be meek to them and turn the other cheek to them and try to bring out their latent sense of fun. Let's give them full air parity and treat the rats with charity. But
letters of complaint poured in. Why was the BBC broadcasting pro-German material? The Director General protested.
I really would be much happier if pressure were brought to bear to cancel this song.
So their peaceable intentions can be always guaranteed. Let's employ with them and sort of strength through joy with them. They're better than us at honest manly fun. Let's let them feel their swell again and bum us all to hell again. But don't let's be beastly to the Hun.
There were phone calls galore to the BBC, strong letters to the national press complaining that Noel Coward was suggesting being friendly with the Germans, etc. And this was a beautifully skillful, surgical, scalpel satire on our attitude to Germany. And these people had misread, misheard, misunderstood the entire point of no-cowed satire. And ultimately, the BBC had to ban it.
The BBC was still, in the words of Ernest Bevin, Minister for Production, the factory of entertainment, trying to keep the country smiling. But the tone of its programmes was now scrutinised by a BBC censorship committee. Auntie was sitting in judgment on the moral standards of the nation. The censorship committee went apoplectic when the Home Service broadcast a risque song by George Formby, My Little Stick of Blackpool Rock, immediately following the Sunday epilogue.
Every day, wherever I stray, the kids all round me flock. A girl while bathing clung to me, I shouted out, oh. She said, I think I'm drowning and you'll save me, I know. I said, well, if you're drowning, do you mind letting go of me little stick of Blackpool Rock?
This song was banned for being filthily suggestive. The censorship committee even turned its attention to the force's sweetheart, Vera Lynn, who was accused of sapping the morale of the troops.
I'm just one girl speaking for all the other girls. There's so much we all want to say to you. So much we're saving up for our moments together again. Until then, we're getting on with our jobs. The jobs that make the days without you seem less lonely.
Till the stars lose their glory, yours, till the birds fail to sing, yours to the end of life's story, this pledge to you.
The soldiers loved Vera, but BBC management had its doubts. Her songs were too slushy. They would make the fighting men homesick. One BBC editor complained,
"It does not do us any good to have a reputation for flabby amusement."
The real complaint was
a surfeit of sentimentality.
what the BBC needed was
a programme of a more virile kind.
And the BBC Board of Governors concluded,
Sincerely yours, deplored, but popularity noted.
Well, the anti-slush campaign came about that the type of programme that I was doing and the kind of songs that I was singing was lowering the morale and making the boys homesick and want to come home, you see. Well, I mean, we proved them wrong. We, you know, with all the BBC, and they said, well, it's so popular and the thousands of letters she gets. It's completely the opposite. So anyway, it didn't go any further, and I was allowed to continue.
For the world is always brighter when it's weathered a heavy storm, and our hearts are always lighter after teardrops have had to fall.
I don't think it sapped the morale of the troops. It gave them the morale. It gave them morale. It's wonderful. We felt, you know, we're transported back to England, if you like, to hear this voice. And it certainly made us think of home, no doubt about it.
Cod liver oil, cod liver oil. It's a fine thing. Yes, and they do say that it builds good, strong teeth and bones.
The Home Service constantly reminded listeners about their diet and advised them to make the most of every scrap of food to avoid shortages.
They give it away, free.
If you saw a queue during the war, the women would join it no matter what it was for. There was such a shortage, you see. And we used to make jokes up, like, what I remember one was my missus saw a long queue and she joined it, and after about 15 minutes in the queue, she tapped the woman on the shoulder in front and said, what are we queuing up for? And the woman said, Tales of Hoffman. And my missus said, well, you've got to eat anything these days.
Now it says you cook for 10 to 15 minutes in a cupful of water. Oh, Arthur, I can't get in a cupful of water. Not you. You don't get into a cupful of water. Put the cabbage in a cupful of water. I can't get the perishing cabbage in a cup of water. No. You put the cabbage and the cup of water in the saucepan. Oh, well, that's different. That's the idea. Well, that's the same to you. Right, now you got that? Right, put the lid on. Yeah. Now it says you shake occasionally during cooking. Okay. That's what it should do.
And Auntie encouraged the nation to keep fit and healthy.
But how are you today? How's your tongue? Is it smooth and red, or knobby and beige with an overcoat of a muddy hue? Well, a word on digestion.
Oh, the radio doctor was a tremendous character, a GP, a family man, who would caution you over your breakfast just before you got up to catch the train about keeping regular habits.
There are those who resolutely refuse to hear the whispering message of the lower bowel, whose motto would seem to be, what I have, I hold. Constipation may even be due to taking medicines to cure it, to taking laxatives as a routine. Please don't whip your bowel each day into a chronic frenzy of irritable activity.
If you cannot attend classes, why not try the 7:30 a.m. BBC physical exercise broadcast?
Left foot forward, bring it back, palms out, by your side, right foot forward, step back, look at the ceiling. On you go.
Hello everyone, this is Henry Hall speaking. Our first number is The Church Mouse on the Spree. The soloist is Bert Smarland.
The Allied armies were victorious in North Africa, but the Germans still occupied the greater part of Europe. From Bush House in London's Aldwych, the BBC broadcast abroad in every language of Nazi-occupied Europe. Their aim was to keep hope alive that the war would end in liberation and victory.
Bush House was a seething marketplace of dispossessed Europeans, actors, writers, performers, philosophers, warriors, name it. People had fled the Germans and regathered in Britain to fight back.
All the exiled royals from Europe who lived in Britain were in and out on a fairly regular basis, boosting the morale of their own people, you see, taking part in various broadcasts.
One of the regulars was Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands.
There was an air raid on and we couldn't go home, so we slept the night. And I kicked down, literally in the corridor. I mean, there was rows of bodies there trying to sleep. And I woke up in the middle of the night and somebody trod on me. And I woke up to discover it was the Queen of the Netherlands going to the loo. It's quite natural for a lady, but it's rather a surprise to me.
Another visitor to Bush House was King Haakon of Norway.
Haakon came in, they said, oh yes, and rang the studio, and the commissioner put his hand over the telephone and said, excuse me, sir, what country did you say you were king of?
To unnerve the German occupying forces, the BBC began its V for Victory campaign over the airwaves.
Now the V sign, and it's three dots and a dash in the Morse code. And this was something you could either put up the dots and dashes, or you could put up the V sign, or eventually you could use the opening motif of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, da-da-da-da. And that was a way of getting at the Germans.
It drove the Germans potty, literally. Because they couldn't do it, because in Germany, the word for victory is Sieg. And Beethoven didn't write anything for S.
This is Colonel Britton speaking to the V Army. Write up your V's again. You know, and I know, what it stands for. And so do the German troops and the Nazi agents. And they don't like it. So put up the V where they'll see it, as the sign of the V Army. Put it up tonight, and for the whole of this week. And beat out the V rhythm, too.
Churchill took up the idea of the sign of the V and used to use it on speeches and when he was touring the country, and he would put up his hand like that to indicate victory was coming, and it became part of his trademark along with his romper suits. Had it not been for the BBC's V campaign, I doubt if Churchill would have adopted this sign.
In a world of poison, said a former French Prime Minister, the BBC became the great antiseptic. News from the BBC fed the underground presses of the resistance movements of Europe and kept hopes of victory alive.
Well, if people are listening to you with very considerable danger and with difficulty, they don't want to hear opinions, they want news, especially if they're cut off from the outside world. News is what people are listening for. They're not listening about your opinions. They're not listening for feature programs. What they want is news.
Ici, Londres. Voici notre 8e bulletin.
The BBC's French service broadcast for 5 hours a day. It brought the news from London and the voices of the free French commentators to German-occupied France.
For the resistance people, the BBC was as important as the air or water you live on, because it was our only, not only our only link with our friends in England, whether they be French or British, but it was also our only link inside the country. We had to listen to the BBC because the censorship of all the media was very, very strict, and only the British were able to bring us news.
Charles de Gaulle, a little-known general in 1940, had escaped to London. Through the BBC, he told the French not to give up hope.
General de Gaulle, without the BBC, could never have started. I mean, if he had not been given not freedom of the airways, but access to the BBC in June 1940, I cannot see how the Free French movement could have possibly developed. We believe that the honor of the French requires us to continue the fight by the side of our allies, and we are resolved to do so. There is absolutely no doubt that the BBC created the Radio General, and that the Radio General knew how to exploit the new medium which was offered to him.
French resistance leader Raymond Aubrac had been captured and tortured by the notorious Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief in Lyon. With his wife Lucy and their 2-year-old son, he escaped to eastern France. There they waited until they received a special coded message from the BBC. By now, Lucy was 8.5 months pregnant. They were told to expect a plane which would take them from the chateau where they were hiding to safety in Britain.
Well, the next thing we had to do was to go to the field. And that was not an easy matter because this lady was pregnant and very big, and she couldn't walk very much, and we had to carry the young chap. We heard the plane circling around the field, of course, and when the lamps had been put up, then the plane would land on the field. And this is when the plane went into the mud, because that field was full of water. The plane began to sink into the mud, and the pilot didn't know what to do. So after having tried once or twice to push his motor as strong as possible, the plane couldn't move. But we needed manpower, and that manpower was brought by the farmers and the peasants and the villagers of the surrounding places. Probably scores, maybe 100 of these people came and began to push that plane out of the mud, and that was not sufficient. They had to go and get horses and oxes and pieces of wood to make channels for the wheels. I always carried a pistol with me And I remember that I had this pistol on this field until the time we boarded the plane. And when we boarded the plane, I gave the pistol to a chap of those groups, and in exchange he gave me a pair of scissors in case the baby would come during the flight. And that's all. And finally we took off, and when we got to those trees over there, the plane was just over the trees, 1 or 2 yards over the trees.
The plane took off and we were away, and the baby was born in London at Queen Charlotte's Hospital.
Our friends wanted to know what would occur with that child to be born. So the BBC sent a message which said, Boubou a une sœur Catherine qui est née le 12, which means Boubou, the name of our son, has a young sister, Catherine, who was born on the 12th. And after that, the German tried to understand what that message could mean.
The Gestapo, it was discovered later, interpreted this message as a coded signal for a resistance uprising. The Germans spent weeks hunting down a resistance group called Boubou, near a village called Catherine. For years, Hitler had railed in his speeches against the Jews. His threats to destroy the Jewish race were picked up by BBC monitoring at its secret base in a collection of Nissen huts near Evesham.
One began to have concrete evidence of the fact that Hitler was actually carrying out his policy of extermination of the Jews.
But there was considerable skepticism both in the Foreign Office and the BBC about the truth of the reports on the fate of the Jews. One Foreign Office official stated bluntly,
Jewish sources are always doubtful.
Another wrote,
Jews tend to exaggerate German atrocities in order to stoke us up.
We were being very careful to try and avoid giving currency to rumors which might not be true and which would then jeopardize our general credibility. In the process, undoubtedly, we did play down the extent of the Holocaust horrors.
This is confirmed by internal BBC documents. The Assistant Director of Children's Hour wrote,
We have found that if you give Jewish broadcasters an inch, they come clamouring for a mile.
And the BBC's Home and Foreign Editorial Boards concluded,
It seems desirable to soft-pedal the whole thing.
It was slow to come out to us, this news, and it was incredible. I mean, that's what I think struck everybody. To say that they actually were setting out to destroy the Jewish race coldly and deliberately, and that, in fact, somewhere between 5 and 6 million Jews were killed out of a pre-war population of between 10 and 11 million in Europe. It was a very, very difficult thing for people to comprehend or believe.
The BBC should have already adopted a higher profile of this whole question. Because, well, at that time, there should have been repeated warnings and very strict and severe warnings that anybody participating in these atrocities and these horrors would have to stand trial and would be punished after the war.
In charge of monitoring German atrocities for the Foreign Office was Frank Roberts.
I certainly have no recollection of being involved myself in holding back the BBC, to put it in those ways, especially at this later stage. I think in the earlier days, around 1941-42, when we and the Jewish organizations, many of them, were skeptical as to the story seemed to be over the top and too much, then conceivably one would have said, go easy. I mean, make sure that you've got good evidence. Because the veracity of the BBC was one of our greatest war assets. And anything that had made people say, well, the BBC got that one completely wrong, so how are we to believe the rest? Would have been important, I mean, in a much wider sense than the purely Jewish question.
Official documents based on eyewitness reports from Poland show that by 1943, the government and the BBC had convincing evidence of the complete extermination of European Jewry. Could the BBC have done more to alert the peoples of occupied Europe?
Warnings to listeners in German-controlled territories. That really was the most important thing of all. But I think it would have been very difficult for them to form an opinion without outside help, that these Jews were never to return, because they might have had a sort of idea that they're being resettled in occupied and conquered territories. And this idea might have appeared quite plausible to them. Now, it would have been very important to try to prove to them in broadcasts that this was not the case, and that actually they were exterminated.
But there were other political reasons for underplaying the plight of the Jews.
We wanted to keep the Middle East quiet. We were a very important part of the war effort. We had to be very careful we didn't give the Arabs the impression that we'd suddenly turned over into a pro-Jewish, pro-Zionist organization. And therefore we must be very careful that whatever we were doing on this was correct and right and could be defended in every kind of way.
But there was nothing ideological or mythic or mythological about it. I mean, it wasn't deeply instinct racial hatred, not at all. It was expediency.
The BBC was at that time the chief purveyor to the public at large of great music. It's like an injection, you know, which protects you against a disease. It's inoculation. Great art is a form of inoculation against diseases which are unspeakable, but which, when translated into art, become a protection.
Yuheni Menuhin lived in the United States, but volunteered to cross the Atlantic to play for the troops and to broadcast with the BBC Symphony Orchestra. He arrived by plane at Croydon Airport to be met by a customs officer.
He asked me to open my violin case, and there was no violin in it. There were all kinds of silk stockings and lipstick and scent, all very precious objects in Britain. There were also 2 bows. I took 2 bows. And you should have seen the passengers laugh when I opened the case, because there I was revealed in all my treachery. He was absolutely superb. He had a calm about him, Sir Adrian, and a precision, and dominated every situation. He really epitomized the Britisher who, you know, could go out in his dinner jacket and face an army of enemies and win.
The Spectator magazine commented,
"Whatever else it may have destroyed, the war has undoubtedly recreated music in our midst, affirming it a living force, vital to the needs of a great people."
After a 2-year break because of the Blitz on London, the BBC's prom concerts returned to be conducted by their founder, Sir Henry Wood.
People all over the world tuned into the BBC. The BBC represented truth, truth in music and truth in words. And truth was a rather rare commodity in the enemy camp.
After fighting their way up through Italy, the Allied armies captured Rome at the beginning of June 1944.
Hello, BBC.
This is Godfrey Talbot reporting from Rome. The city is going absolutely wild. Dense crowds, thousands and thousands, are in the streets and squares in their best clothes, waving, crying with joy, clapping and cheering their heads off. The army passing through in tanks, cars and jeeps. They're being mobbed as never before. There never was such a Roman holiday.
As soon as our truck appeared, Belinda from the desert, I was aware of Italians coming out through the streets and through the piazzas and saying, BBC, BBC, BBC. It was quite embarrassing. I was pulled off the truck. I was put into a motor car. I was given, or at any rate, offered bunches of roses, bottles of wine, their daughters, anything. I was offered everything. And it took a good deal of time for me and my engineer and my colleagues to escape from the crowds and go to the balcony in Palazzo Venezia, where Mussolini used to get up and spout his speeches.
But from that balcony in the Palazzo Venezia, no Duce, no Mussolini, but instead this morning, 2 Allied soldiers appeared, dirty, straight from the line and on their way through this great city, and beside them stood 2 Romans, ordinary citizens from the crowd in the square below.
It was under pain of death that they had listened to any radio at all during the German occupation of Rome, and I discovered that they'd been following the war through our, and largely apparently, my own voice. They knew what Godfrey Talbot was and who he was and what the BBC was.
In Britain, the build-up for D-Day, the long-awaited invasion of Europe, was now underway. The Americans and their big bands, broadcast by the BBC, were here in force.
My proudest moment was when they sent for me, the War Office sent me with a message to say, you will report to Bulford Barracks, Tidworth, Salisbury Plain, and entertain the arrival of the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower. And I went there and entertained him on the stage and all. And at the end of the show, he made his first speech in this country. He said, ladies and gentlemen, we've shown cheerful Charlie we can laugh. Now we're going to show the whole British nation we can fight.
The D-Day message to the Allied armies from the commander of the invasion forces, General Montgomery, was broadcast by the BBC and heard all over the world.
The time has come to deal the enemy a terrific blow in Western Europe. I send my best wishes to every soldier in the Allied team. To us is given the honor of striking a blow for freedom which will live in history. And in the better days that lie ahead, men will speak with pride of our doings.
He used to say to me, using your microphone, I can be the first general in history who can speak to every soldier in his army, because all my men are listening to the BBC the whole time. And if I can record with you and the BBC puts it over the air, they will all hear me. And increasingly, one got him to see that broadcasting was an arm of warfare. And, you know, so broadcasting really was a fourth arm of warfare. You had land warfare, you had warfare on the sea, you had warfare in the air, you had the warfare for the hearts and minds of men and women all over the place, and broadcasting was one of the great instruments of getting at the hearts and minds of people.
I want every soldier to know that I have complete confidence in the successful outcome of the operations that we are now about to begin. Good luck to each one of you, and good hunting on the mainland of Europe.
With D-Day came the most ambitious of the BBC's wartime coverage. A daily programme, War Report, followed the news each evening and brought commentary direct from the battlefront to listeners ever more hungry for news. In the last year of the war, the BBC became identified with the voices of its team of correspondents from the War Reporting Unit. What made this technically possible was the so-called midget recorder. It was like a wind-up gramophone and recorded on discs which lasted only 2 minutes. It weighed a hefty 40 pounds and was the BBC's first portable recorder.
All the recordings
that have survived the campaign in Normandy, and we used it right through, of course, from the heat of the summer right through the winter and so on. All the recordings that have really survived were made on this sort of instrument.
Hello BBC, this is Frank Gillard here, recording just outside Tilly, a mile or two back from Tilly, on Friday morning, June the 16th, during a barrage which is being laid down to prepare the way for an infantry attack on a small village just to the east of Tilly. In this barrage, we've got our 4.2-inch mortars, our field guns, our medium guns, all the guns of the fleet. The shells are whistling overhead now, just listen to them. I'm not certain if you can hear that high-pitched whistle. The whistle of the shell as it actually slips through the trees overhead here. I'm lying down at full length here in the cornfield. Just in the hedges around me, I can see many men taking shelter behind the banks wearing their steel helmets while this terrific barrage goes on around us.
I had to get all the facts in, and at the same time try to bring in a bit of colour, and to use my recording equipment as far as I could in order to bring in the sounds, the racket, the pandemonium of battle, the voices of the commanders, the voices of the troops, all the associated elements of atmosphere which built up the whole picture of what was happening on these fronts and bringing it right to the fireside at home.
The road into Tilly is a road of devastation. The farmhouses, the cottages, almost every building along the road, they're either gutted out or smashed up by shell fire. Burnt out tanks and cars and trucks were lying in the blackened hedges. Every yard of this road was shouting at you that it had been fought for bitterly. Suddenly, without quite knowing how, there we were, right in the middle of the little town. We'd breasted a slope, and there was Tilly before us, down in a little dip, with a crossroads at the bottom.
We were determined to seize this village. We had to open up the roadway to our advance to the south and to clear the crossroads which would give us another advance towards the city of Caen. Hand-to-hand fighting, shell fire, fighting that went on for considerable time, days, and eventually this place became ours. But it was a total wreck.
It was a ghastly, a sickening sight. I've never seen a place so completely obliterated. Tilly has just ceased to exist. Every house, every building is just absolutely, utterly a ruin. There's nothing left of this town but jagged, blackened walls and heaps of smouldering rubble. There was a horrible reek of death and destruction. The bodies were lying there in the ruins and along the roadside, terrible to look at. Some of them with the flesh burnt from their bones. This was war in its most appalling form.
The reports recorded by the war correspondents had to be transmitted back to London as quickly as possible for broadcast by the BBC. Within a fortnight of D-Day, Frank Gillard had established a makeshift studio in the tower of the Chateau de Cruilly.
It's from this room that the news of the progress of this great battle, on which so much depended, was given to the outside world in so many languages. And here on the walls are the photographs of some of my colleagues, the correspondents, who were broadcasting from this room. And we were presided over here, well, first of all, here was our radio receiver, which kept us in touch with London. Here was the amplifier, and presided over by a photograph of the Commander-in-Chief, General Montgomery, with a handsome inscription. Very appropriate that he should be there, because out of this window, we look straight down on his own headquarters.
It was from Montgomery's HQ that an unusual request came through. The general, who loved animals, wanted a puppy to keep him company. Could the BBC help?
I found a patrol of our tanks, and I said to the tank commander, do you know any place where I can get a puppy? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, there is a Frenchman in that town who's got a bitch, a fox terrier bitch, with 3 puppies, and he might sell you one of them. Although I told him it was for the great general and so on, he charged me, I remember, £25, or the equivalent of £25 in occupation money, which was a lot of cash in those days. Anyway, purchased the puppy, took it to Monty, who was absolutely delighted with it, you know. Immediately christened the wretched thing Hitler, and then sent a special letter to me from his headquarters. He said, "I'd like to thank you and all the BBC staff in France for the very delightful fox terrier puppy you gave me. I've named him Hitler." And he said, "I've got another puppy, a golden cocker spaniel, and he's named Rommel. And both Hitler and Rommel are learning their stuff and coming to heal well. Thank you very much. Yours sincerely, B.L. Montgomery." But the puppy gave Monty immense pleasure right up to the last day of the war when, would you believe it, it was run over by a tank.
BBC Home Service. Here is the news, read by Richard Wesley. Paris has been liberated.
It's been one of the most marvellous sights I've ever seen, coming down the boulevards into the heart of Paris. Everywhere we went, people came running out of their houses, out of the shops, shaking hands with us. Children were held up to us to be kissed, and they clung around our necks. People were giving us flowers, tomatoes, everything. It's been the most marvellous procession I've ever seen. Here they are, they're just mad with joy.
Also with the liberating forces was a reporter for the BBC French service, Pierre Lefebvre.
We suddenly heard a hullabaloo, a great whoo happening down this avenue, so we hurriedly came here. And here on this side of the avenue was a massed crowd of people being held back as trooping out of the Hotel Majestic, which this building was at the time, came high officials of the Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, Luftwaffe, in their uniforms, holding briefcases, attaché cases, and holding up their arms. The remnant of the German High Command. These were the last remaining people in the offices here, and they were being lined up against that balustrade you can see, as if they were going to be shot. Well, they took them away in the truck to get away from this crowd of people who wanted to lynch them.
Liberation was also a time for settling old scores with those suspected of collaborating with the Germans.
People would say, "That girl works in the Gestapo offices," and they would drag her out and rip her clothes off and shave her head. And we managed to step in and say, well, she'll be arrested and tried. A lot of that happened. Resistance people who went crazy and thought they could do anything they liked, you know. That's the unpleasant side of liberation. People go berserk with resentment and reprisals.
An estimated 100,000 people, both guilty and innocent, were hunted down throughout France and killed following the wild days of liberation in August 1944. And once again, the BBC hesitated to broadcast details of the unacceptable face of war.
I think the BBC could have played a very important part at that particular time, and it might have avoided these excesses, whereas the excesses were played down, never referred to in the broadcasts from London, which tended to give the impression that there was tacit approval of them, which I don't think there was, but that was the impression that was given.
The Allied air forces were now pounding German cities nightly. BBC reporters flew with them.
Hello, skipper. Hello, navigator. Half a minute to go. Okay, thanks very much. Keep weaving, Ken. Bomb doors open. Bomb doors open, bombardier. Right. Steady. Steady. Arms away. Steady. There goes the cookie. Lucky.
Richard Dimbleby flew 20 sorties with the RAF over Germany.
And just then, another Lancaster dropped a load of incendiaries. And where, a moment before, there had been a dark patch of the city, a dazzling silver pattern spread itself. A rectangle of brilliant lights, hundreds, thousands of them, winking and gleaming and lighting the outlines of the city around them. As though this unloading had been the signal, score after score of fire bombs went down, and all over the dark face of the German capital, these great incandescent flower beds spread themselves. It was a fascinating sight.
By March 1945, there were 29 BBC war reporters operating from the front line in Europe and the Far East. By now, their voices were well known. They wore army uniform and had been trained on assault courses and in parachuting, gunnery, signals, and military intelligence. They lived as soldiers and were nicknamed the BBC Commandos. They risked their lives daily to bring reports from the thick of the action.
We're in. The Buffalo dips its nose down the bank, and now it's opening up full power. We are racing across, and side by side with us go racing the other buffaloes, racing for that hell on the other side. Now we're utterly alone, it seems, right out in the midst of this swirling stream. We've got a complete feeling of detachment, waiting all the time for the enemy to open up.
There was a new realism in War Report. Now Allied casualties were described, not just the enemies.
Just a few feet off the ground, pandemonium broke loose. The wicked snap of Spandau machine guns mixed with the slower bong of 20mm incendiaries for just a fraction of a second before they started pricking out their trademark in the thin skin of the glider. Things seemed to happen too quickly for me to take them all in at once. There was an explosion that appeared to be inside my head, the smell of burnt cordite. I went down on one knee. Something hot and sickly was dripping over my right eye and off my chin and all over my clothes. I saw my pal, Peter Cattle, lying on one elbow with blood making a spider web over his face. One of the men was on the floor, staring fixedly at nothing as one of his legs, rigid in front of him, was quivering in convulsions like a stricken eel. Even then, the bullets kept crashing through the wreckage. It didn't seem fair, but then there's no fair or unfair in airborne fighting.
Stanley Maxted survived, but 2 of his 29 colleagues from War Report were killed in action in the last year of war.
First contact between advanced units of the American First Army and the Russian First Ukrainian Army Group in the heart of the Reich was made by radio.
A month later, the advance of the Allies into Germany had brought their armies from east and west together for the first time.
The great worry was that the two armies wouldn't recognize each other and would fire on each other when they came close. That did not happen. And on this particular day, a forward patrol of an American infantry division encountered a similar forward patrol from a Soviet position in the area between the Elbe and the Mulde River. They couldn't talk to each other because they didn't have the language to do it, but they recognized each other's uniforms, they saluted, they shook hands, they laughed, they cheered, and all the rest of it.
We in this country heard the meeting described by Frank Gillard, BBC war correspondent, in these dramatic words.
This is the news for which the whole Allied world has been waiting. East and West have met. At 20 minutes to 5 on Wednesday afternoon, April the 25th, 1945, American troops of General Bradley's 12th Army Group made contact with Soviet elements of Marshal Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Army Group near the German town of Torgau on the Elbe. Nazi Germany, tottering to her final collapse, has been split clean in half. The forces of liberation have joined hands.
And so it was my voice that announced to the world, East and West have met. A great, great moment, I saw. I've treasured it ever since.
On the 15th of April 1945, the Allies entered Belsen concentration camp. There they discovered 40,000 dead and dying. It was Richard Dimbleby's greatest challenge to find the words to describe the horror of what he saw, for a war report which he knew would shock the world.
Here, over an acre of ground, lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which, except perhaps by a convulsive movement or the last quiver of a sigh from a living skeleton too weak to move. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do and no hope of life. Women stood and squatted, stark naked in the dust, trying to wash themselves and to catch the lice on their bodies.
When the British troops entered Belsen concentration camp, Richard Dimbleby came in, and we felt like a man from a different planet. He came in gave us so much hope that we are not alone now anymore. That he came and the hope he gave us, and that people do know what happened to us, and we be able to maybe find our relatives, our beloved ones.
The SS guards, who shot several of the prisoners after we'd arrived in the camp when they thought no one was looking, are now gathering up all the bodies and carting them away for burial.
We felt that at last the world would know what really went on. So Richard Dimbleby made that possible for everyone, and I feel that, I'm sure, he was the one who brought the news to the rest of the world.
When Dimbleby's report reached the BBC newsroom, they did not believe him and refused to transmit it. When he threatened to resign, the report was broadcast. The full horrors of the Holocaust were now revealed for the first time.
This is London calling. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
Outside Hitler's bunker are 5 petrol cans used for burning his body, and with them the tattered remains of clothing. The whole of this Reich Chancellery has fallen to pieces, and with it have gone the last vestiges of Nazi power.
Hello, BBC. This is Chester Wilmot speaking from Field Marshal Montgomery's tactical headquarters on a high, windswept hill on the wild Lüneburger Heath near the River Elbe. Now, inside the tent, Field Marshal Montgomery...
On the 4th of May, 1945, the German forces in northwest Europe surrendered to Field Marshal Montgomery.
The decision of the Allied powers will be final. If any doubt or dispute arises as to the meaning or interpretation of the surrender terms. That is the text of the instrument of surrender, and the German delegation will now sign this paper.
The BBC had hoped to broadcast the whole of Chester Wilmot's report live from Germany, but the equipment failed just after Wilmot had gone on air. Fortunately, a recording was made, and the momentous news was broadcast later that evening, this time without mishap.
Well, Admiral Wagner will sign next.
There was one final and sad experience for Frank Gillard.
9th December, we were looking for a British soldier to speak from Germany in the BBC's big round-the-world Christmas afternoon programme. A Tommy in Germany to round off the whole programme and to speak immediately before His Majesty the King gave his Christmas message. In the end, we found the very man we wanted, a Londoner, Corporal R.B. Pass of the 1st 5th Queen's Royal Regiment.
The sad payoff to the story is the day after the armistice, the end of the war, was finally settled, the day after that, Corporal Pass went out in order to bring in to his lines a group of Germans who were advancing under a white flag of surrender. And one of them shot him dead, which is a monstrous thing to do.
very great crowd is collected already. Thousands upon thousands of people gathered to share this historic day with the King and Queen.
Here they come. First Her Majesty the Queen, it comes into view, then the King in the uniform of an Admiral of the Fleet, the two princesses standing on the balcony, listen to the crowd.
My feelings on VE Day were something was missing from life. No one was shooting, there were no bangs. It's a silly thing to say, perhaps. I'm sure many people felt the same, that it was very strange to be still, for the air to be still, for the troops to be singing and not fighting. My feelings on VE Day were of something that was over. One was aware of something that had gone from life, but I was aware very much that my organisation, my British Broadcasting Corporation, that I joined before the war, that I'd tried to serve all through the war, that the BBC radio had been a weapon of war, and a major weapon of war. There's no doubt about that whatever.
We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day. Tomorrow will also be Victory in Europe Day. But let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead. Japan, with all her treachery and greed, remains unsubdued. The injuries she has inflicted upon Great Britain, the United States and other countries, and her detestable cruelties call for justice and retribution. We must now devote all our strength and resources to the completion of our tasks, both at home and abroad. Advance Britannia. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
In the end, what validates propaganda is victory. And if we had lost the war, the BBC would have been blamed for a great deal of it. We won the war, and so the BBC received a lot of credit.
So we come to the end of another program played to you by the BBC Dance Orchestra, directed by Henry Hall. Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye.
Program for tonight. Good night, everybody. Good night.
There's a BBC book to accompany the programme, What Did You Do in the War, Auntie? And it's available from bookshops.